There is a moment, and every species that has ever reached for the stars knows it, when you stop watching a civilization and start fearing it. Not because they are violent, not because they are cruel, not even because they are powerful, because they are hungry, not for food, not for land, for something worse, understanding. I have watched 1,000 civilizations bloom and collapse in my 400,000 years of service to the Galactic Observation Corps. I have cataloged the Vreth, who built monuments the size of moons, and then quietly went extinct from boredom. I have filed reports on the Sulhuri, whose empires stretched across 11-star systems before they folded inward like a dying star and became myth. I have watched species rise on the backs of violence, of mathematics, of pure dumb luck, and I have watched every single one of them hit a ceiling. Some wall of complexity or fear or comfort that stopped them cold. And after that, they just maintained. They all maintained. And then I was assigned to Earth. And I made what my superiors would later call, in the most clinical language they could manage, a catastrophic error of underestimation. What I called it, standing on the observation platform as the third human faster-than-light drive test cracked a small and previously unremarkable portion of the space-time continuum, was simpler. I called it, "Oh no, this is my report. This is what I saw. This is why the galaxy shook. Not from their weapons, not from their wars, but from the sound of a species that refused, at every single turn, to stay where you put them. I should have seen it coming. I didn't. None of US did. My designation is Vale Soren 7. Observer Class. 4th tier, which in the Galactic Observation Corps means I am senior enough to be assigned a solo post, but junior enough that nobody important checks my reports unless something goes wrong. For 312 years, I had maintained a clean record. No anomalies, no surprises, no incidents requiring escalation. My supervisor, a massive crystalline being named Dovel, who communicated exclusively through harmonic resonance, had described my work as admirably unremarkable. In the Corps, that is the highest compliment. I was assigned to the Sol system in what the humans call the year 2041. The briefing was short. The Galactic Observation Corps had been monitoring Earth for approximately 6,000 years at that point, which in cosmic terms is a blink. The file was thin. Bipedal carbon-based species. High aggression index. Moderate intelligence rating. Respectable, not exceptional. Notable for unusual emotional complexity, which the original classification team had flagged as a potential long-term complication, but ultimately rated low priority. The species had recently, in the last century of their timeline, developed nuclear weapons, then promptly spent several decades pointing those weapons at each other without actually using them, which the Corps found baffling. Most species, once they had weapons capable of total self-annihilation, either used them or dismantled them. Humans had done neither. They just lived with the threat, filed it next to other daily anxieties, and kept building things. That detail was in the report. I didn't weight it properly. My post was a cloaked observation platform set in geosynchronous orbit above the North American continent, roughly above what the humans called the Midwest. The platform was standard issue, a gray disk about 40 meters across, with full-spectrum sensors, a quantum-encrypted uplink to Corps headquarters, a small galley that produced adequate but not inspiring meals, and a single chair positioned in front of a floor-to-ceiling viewing screen. The screen could display any point on Earth's surface in real time at any magnification. It could also model projections, run probability calculations, and overlay historical data. It was, in short, everything I needed to do my job. My job, to be precise, was to observe and document, not intervene. Never intervene. The Corps was very clear on that point. There were 347 pages of protocol governing intervention, all of which could be summarized as don't. The civilizations of the galaxy were not to be interfered with. They were to be watched, cataloged, and rated on a standardized development scale that went from level 1, primitive tool use, to level 12, theoretical mastery of fundamental physics. Most species that the Corps monitored sat between level 4 and level 6 for the majority of their development window. The ceiling was level 9. No species in recorded galactic history had ever achieved level 10. Earth, when I arrived, was rated level 5. Solidly mid-range. Interplanetary travel. Check. Early computational networks. Check. Basic genetic manipulation. Check. They had all the marks of a species that would plateau somewhere around level 6, maintain a comfortable solar system-level civilization for several 100,000 years, and eventually either evolve into something unrecognizable or quietly fade. Either outcome was fine. Both outcomes were documented. I had seen both happen. I settled into my chair, reviewed the existing surveillance data from the previous observer team, and began my watch. The first thing I noticed was the speed. Not the speed of their technology, the speed of their thinking. Most species I had observed operated on what I mentally called institutional time. An idea would emerge in one place, a research institution, a government body, a philosophical school, and would spread outward over decades, sometimes centuries before it reached critical mass and became a paradigm shift. This was normal. This was, in fact, healthy. It gave civilizations time to process change, to adapt culturally and socially to technological leaps before the next one arrived. The species that moved too fast through technological development without the cultural scaffolding to support it tended to collapse. I had seen that too. Humans move fast, not just physically, though their cities, even from orbit, had an energy to them that I found difficult to describe at first. A constant motion like something boiling. They moved fast intellectually. An idea that emerged in one of their research institutions on a Monday morning could, through their global information network, be challenged, refined, expanded, contested, and rebuilt by Friday afternoon. I watched this happen with a propulsion concept in a facility in New Mexico. A researcher named Dr. Amara Osei published preliminary data on a new approach to plasma confinement at 9:14 in the morning. By noon, 47 other researchers across 12 countries had accessed the paper. By 3 p.m., someone in Bangalore had already identified a structural flaw and proposed a correction. By the following Tuesday, a team in Tokyo had incorporated both the original work and the correction into a physical prototype. 11 days from initial concept to working model. I filed this in my report as unusual development velocity and went back to watching. I should have flagged it as something more than unusual. The year 2041 was, by human reckoning, a period of what they called acceleration. Their word for it. They had noticed it themselves, that feeling of the world moving faster than it had moved before, of technologies compressing on top of each other before anyone had properly figured out the last one. They talked about it with a mixture of excitement and what I can only describe as vertigo. They were a species in the middle of their own paradigm shift, aware that they were in the middle of it and charging forward anyway. Some of them were afraid. Most of them were afraid. And they kept going. That quality, the keeping going despite the fear, I had not seen in quite that configuration before. Other species had shown courage. Other species had shown determination. But there was something particular about the human relationship with fear that I could not quite classify in any of my existing categories. They did not overcome fear and then act. They acted while afraid. The fear came along for the ride. Sometimes it made them make mistakes. Sometimes the mistakes killed them. And then the ones who were still alive would look at the wreckage, process it, and figure out how not to make that particular mistake again. They called this learning. Every species learned, but not like this. The incident that first made me genuinely sit up straight happened in October of 2041, 6 months into my posting. A joint international team. And this itself was notable because humans had spent most of their history treating the concept of international cooperation like a plate of food they knew they should eat but didn't really enjoy, had been running experiments with quantum field manipulation at a facility buried 2 kilometers under the Swiss mountains. I had been monitoring this project on low-priority rotation. The theoretical framework they were working from was according to my core-issued physics modeling system, promising but, at least 40 years from practical application. They achieved practical application. In October, I remember the exact moment the sensor suite lit up. I had been eating, which is something I do out of habit more than necessity. My species processes solar energy, but the galley had produced something that approximated a warm soup, and I was holding it and watching the daily data scroll, and then every screen on the platform shifted to alert status simultaneously, and I spilled the soup on my uniform, and for a long moment just stood there with soup dripping onto the floor reading the numbers. The quantum field effect they had produced was small. Contained. By objective physical standards, it was barely detectable. But what it represented was not small and not barely detectable. What it represented was a species that had just, without any awareness of the significance of what they were doing, taken a running jump at a door that the rest of the galaxy had been politely standing outside of for millennia. I filed an urgent report to Dovell. The response came back in 48 hours, which for Dovell was essentially panic speed. It said, in harmonic resonance that I have translated here as best I can, confirm observation. Assess whether result is reproducible or anomalous. Do not escalate to council until confirmation. Then a pause. Then, are you certain the data is correct? I confirmed the data was correct. I assessed the result. It was reproducible. I escalated to council anyway, because I had been watching these people for 6 months, and I had developed, against every protocol, against every training principle, I had been instilled with over 300 years of service, something that I would describe, with professional embarrassment, as a strong intuition about where this was going. The council did not respond immediately. The council, composed of representatives from 37 elder species, operated on something closer to geological time. They had seen it all. They were not, as an institutional body, easily moved. Their response time for non-emergency escalations averaged 4 months. I was not classified as an emergency. I kept watching. In November, the Swiss team published their findings. The global human research community did what it always did with a paradigm-shifting result. It erupted. Some researchers rejected it. Some embraced it so hard they embarrassed themselves. Most of the serious ones started replicating and extending. Within 3 months, there were 14 active research teams working from the Swiss data. Within 6 months, there were 60. The original researchers, Dr. Unipark and her team, had moved on to the next problem. They described the field effect, filed the papers, and turned immediately to what they call the obvious next question. The obvious next question, in Dr. Park's framing, was whether the field could be sustained, directed, and scaled. The answer to all three, she had apparently decided before asking, was yes. I watched her work. I watched all of them work, but I watched her most closely because she had a quality that I struggled to name for a long time. Other scientists I had observed across many species had brilliance, dedication, rigor. She had all of those, but she also had something else. She moved through problems the way some of the humans I had observed moved through physical obstacles. Not around them, not carefully over them, but through them with a kind of bulldozing confidence that seemed to come not from certainty, but from an absolute refusal to accept that a problem was bigger than her. She was wrong sometimes. She was wrong loudly and publicly and with great commitment. And then she corrected course and kept going. 40 years from practical application. 8 months. I stopped eating the soup. I stopped doing anything that wasn't watching. Because in December, 312 days into my posting, Dr. Unipark's team sustained a directed quantum field effect for 11 consecutive seconds. 11 seconds. Long enough to be called control. Long enough to be called a weapon, or an engine, or a door. Long enough for me to understand that the rating in the core file, level 5, solidly mid-range, plateau expected, no anomalies anticipated, was a number attached to a species that no longer existed. I didn't know what to call them now. I sent another report. Then I sat back in my chair and looked at the earth below me, blue and white and quietly extraordinary, and thought about the 6,000 years of human history I had inherited in that thin file. The collapses and the rebuildings. The wars that ended things and the things that survived the wars. The persistent, irrational, species-wide refusal to accept that any ceiling was final. The core had a phrase for civilizations that moved too fast. It wasn't a flattering phrase. It was Cascade risk. I opened a file on Cascade risk classifications. I read the criteria. I looked at my data. I opened a new report to the full council, not just Dovell. In 400,000 years of galactic observation core history, no observer had ever used the Cascade risk classification for a civilization below level 7. I used it for a level 5 civilization. I used it because I had watched Amara Osei build a prototype in 11 days. I had watched Una Park refuse 11 times to believe a problem was unsolvable. I had watched a species hold a loaded weapon to its own head for 100 years and decide, apparently, that the correct response was to use the other hand to keep building things. The council would take months to respond. The humans would not wait months. They never waited. That was the whole problem. That was the whole magnificent, terrifying, galaxy-shaking problem. The council's response, when it finally arrived, was not what Vale Soren 7 expected. It was dismissal. Not hostile dismissal. Polite dismissal. The kind that comes wrapped in institutional language and delivered with the tone of someone explaining to a child that the thing they thought was a monster under the bed is, in fact, a shadow. The senior representative of the Vrethian Elder Delegation, a species that had been spacefaring for so long they had actually forgotten their own origin planet and spent 3 centuries arguing about which of several candidates it was, sent back a harmonic-encoded message that translated, stripped of its diplomatic packaging, to something like, "We appreciate your diligence." Cascade risk protocols exist for species above level 7. Please continue your observations and file standard quarterly reports. We note that your posting duration is relatively short. Longer perspective may recalibrate your assessment. Longer perspective. Vale Soren 7 read that phrase 3 times. Then open the surveillance feed on Dr. Park's lab in Geneva and watch her team achieve sustained directional field effect for 44 seconds. That was January of 2042. By March, the directional field could be produced at will on a repeatable schedule, without the equipment failures that had plagued the first 3 months of the work. The Swiss team had been joined by 2 parallel teams, one in South Korea, one in Brazil, who were working from the published data and had already extended it in directions Dr. Park hadn't considered yet. The Brazilian team, led by a man named Dr. Marcus Cavalcani, who had the energy of someone who had been waiting his whole life for exactly this problem to exist, had taken the directional field and started asking what happened if you stack 2 of them perpendicular to each other. The answer to that question, discovered on the 14th of March at approximately 2 a.m. Brasilia time, was that you got a spatial compression effect. Small, contained, barely measurable, also completely impossible, according to the galactic standard model of physics, which had been considered settled doctrine for approximately 60,000 years. Vale Soren 7 sent the data to Dovell without a message attached. Just the numbers. Just the raw sensor output. Dovell's response came in 6 hours, which was the fastest Vale Soren 7 had ever received a reply from a supervisor in 300 years of service. It said, again translating loosely from harmonic resonance, "I am reviewing. Do not escalate further until I have reviewed." Then, after a pause that Vale Soren 7's translation algorithms flagged as emotionally significant, "Are they aware of what they have done?" The answer was no. Not yet. Cavalcani's team knew they had produced a spatial anomaly. They did not yet know what it implied. They were still in the phase that human scientists called checking whether we broke the equipment, which was the step that came before figuring out what we actually discovered. They were running verification protocols, double-checking sensors, looking for sources of error. They were in the particular way that good scientists are, trying hard to prove themselves wrong before they let themselves be right. They were not going to be able to prove themselves wrong. Vale Soren 7 watched the verification process run its course over the next 2 weeks and thought about the galactic standard model of physics, about the 60,000 years of accumulated data that underpinned it, about the 37 elder species whose entire technological infrastructure, the FTL networks, the energy grids, the communication arrays that knit the galactic community together, was built on that model. About the Vrithian representative who had used the phrase longer perspective. The Vrithian had been spacefaring for 400,000 years. In those 400,000 years, they had refined the standard model, extended it, found its edges, and mapped them with extraordinary precision. They had not, in 400,000 years, found a way through those edges. Neither had any other species. The edges were considered, not as a matter of opinion, but as a matter of verified experimental fact, impassable. Kuvolk and his team had found a gap in one of those edges by stacking two field effects that had only existed for 8 months. Vale, Soren, 7 made a decision that went against protocol. The observer activated the platform's deep scan suite, the equipment reserved for detailed analysis, which used considerably more power than passive observation and could, in theory, be detected by sufficiently sensitive instruments on the surface, and began running a full physics modeling simulation of the Brazilian team's effect. The simulation ran for 4 hours. The results were unambiguous. What Kuvolk and his team had found was not a curiosity. It was not an edge case or an experimental artifact. It was a door, a specific, reproducible, theoretically extensible mechanism that, if developed along the obvious trajectory, would lead to controlled spatial compression at macro scale. Faster than light travel. Not in 40 years. Not in 20. At current development velocity, somewhere between 4 and 7 years. Vale, Soren, 7 sat with that number for a long time. 4 to 7 years. A species that had been a level 5 civilization 14 months ago. A species that had not yet made contact with any other intelligent life. A species that, by every standard metric, should have been decades away from even asking the right questions about FTL physics, let alone answering them. The observer filed a new escalation request, this time with the simulation data attached, this time marked as Priority 1. The Vrithian representative responded in 2 days. The response was longer this time, more careful. It went through the data with the kind of attention that Vale Soren 7 had wanted from the beginning. And at the end of it, after acknowledging that yes, the spatial compression effect appeared genuine, and yes, the theoretical trajectory appeared to lead where the observer had indicated, the representative said something that Vale Soren 7 would think about for a long time after. The representative said, "This is not the first time a young species has approached these boundaries ahead of schedule. In all previous cases, the development has stalled at the translation problem. They find the physics. They cannot build the engineering. The gap between theoretical and applied typically consumes a generation of researchers and allows time for cultural and societal calibration. We will monitor, but we assess the translation problem as the effective ceiling for this species in the near term. Please continue observations. The translation problem. The gap between knowing the physics and building the machine. It was Vale Soren 7 had to admit a real phenomenon. Other species had hit it. The Sulhuri had understood FTL theory for 600 years before they built a working drive. The Keth Consortium had spent 2 centuries in the gap. It was a genuine obstacle. Complex engineering, materials science, power requirements, computational demand. Each component requiring a revolution in its own right before the whole thing could be assembled. The representative was not wrong about the general principle. The representative was Vale Soren 7 suspected deeply wrong about this specific species. Because here was what the Vrithian representative did not know, had probably not bothered to look up about Earth in the year 2042. What Vale Soren 7 had been watching for 14 months and filing in the quarterly reports that no one was reading carefully. The humans had already solved half of the translation problem. Not for FTL, they didn't know about FTL yet. But the individual components that the translation problem required, advanced materials capable of extreme stress and temperature tolerances, power generation systems that could produce and sustain energy at scale, computational architectures capable of real-time modeling of complex dynamic systems had all been aggressively developed in the previous decade. Not for space travel, for other things. For energy grids, for medical technology, for climate adaptation infrastructure. The humans, in their particular way of solving 10 problems at once without necessarily meaning to, had built the pieces without knowing what they were pieces of. When Dr. Kovalkh and his team published their results in April, those pieces were already on the shelf. The global response was, even by human standards, intense. Every major space agency on Earth redirected research priority within 60 days of publication. Private aerospace companies, several of which had already been operating with ambitions that their respective governments found either inspiring or alarming, depending on the political context, announced parallel development programs. 3 universities began dedicated research tracks. An open-source collaboration platform, seated by a collective of researchers who believed the work was too important to be siloed in institutions or corporations, launched in May and had 12,000 registered contributors by June. 12,000 researchers, 37 separate parallel development tracks, all working from the same base data, all building, refining, extending, correcting each other in real time through the global network that had made their idea velocity so dizzying to watch. Vale, Soren, 7 looked at this network from orbit and thought about the Sulhuri 600-year gap, about the Keth Consortium's 2 centuries, about the translation problem as a ceiling. Then looked at the timeline projections the platform's modeling system was now spitting out with increasing urgency. The model had initially said 4 to 7 years. It was now saying 2 to 4. In June, the materials problem was solved by a team in Lagos that had been working on high-stress composite materials for deep-sea infrastructure. They were not working on FTL components. They were working on ocean floor habitats. But the material they developed, a self-reinforcing crystalline lattice structure that got stronger under compression rather than weaker, was exactly what the spatial compression field containment system needed. Someone on the open-source collaboration platform noticed this in July, made the connection, posted it. Within a week, the Lagos materials team and the Kovalkh spatial field team were on a video call. Within a month, they were the same team. The power requirement problem, which Valcern 7 had privately flagged as the most significant remaining obstacle, was addressed in September by something that the humans had been developing for energy grid applications, a fusion reactor design that had been in the late stages of testing in Scotland. It was not yet commercially deployed. It was not yet producing energy at the scale the FTL application would require. But it was producing energy at a scale that was based on the trajectory of development, plausibly close enough that the researchers could design around it and work toward it simultaneously. The translation problem was supposed to take a generation. It was taking 18 months. Dovel checked in with an unusual message in October. Not a response to a report, an unprompted communication. The first one in Vale, Soren 7's 300-year career. It said, "I have been reviewing your data logs. I want you to understand that I have served in the Corps for 900,000 years. I have observed 240 civilizations. I have never personally submitted a Cascade risk assessment. I am considering submitting one now in support of yours. I want you to tell me, what is driving this? Their technology moves like I understand, but something underneath the technology does not operate like anything in my classification history. What is that thing?" Vale, Soren 7 thought about that question for 3 days before answering. Because it was the right question. The technology was visible. The development velocity was measurable. The engineering solutions were documentable. But underneath all of it was something that resisted the standard observational categories, some quality of the species itself that was producing the velocity, enabling the connections, pushing through the translation problem at speeds that should have been impossible. The observer wrote back to Dovel, "I have been trying to name it for 14 months. The closest I can get is this. Every other species I have data on has a ceiling it can identify, a practical limit on what it believes it can do. The ceiling may be wrong. Many species can go beyond what they believe, but the belief in the ceiling shapes behavior. It creates hesitation. It creates the periods of consolidation that allow cultural adaptation. It creates the translation gap. Vol Surin fut posted. Looked at the feed from Geneva, where Dr. Park's team had just run a new simulation. Looked at the feed from Lagos, from the open source platform, where 300 new contributors had registered today. These people do not appear to have that belief. Or, if they have it, it does not operate the way it does in other species. They describe ceilings constantly. They call them impossible, decades away, theoretical only beyond current capability. They describe the ceiling. Then they walk through it, not because they are unaware of the ceiling, because the description of the ceiling seems to function for them as an instruction rather than a boundary. Another pause. An instruction to push. Dovel went quiet for 11 days. Then sent back a single line. I am filing the Cascade risk assessment. I am also requesting an emergency session of the full council. I think they should watch what happens next. What happened next was December of 2042. Dr. Park's team, in the underground facility in Geneva that had by now expanded 3 times over and been joined by researchers from 41 countries, ran the first full-scale integration test of the spatial compression field with the new containment materials and the upgraded power supply. The test was supposed to run for 30 seconds. It ran for 4 minutes and 17 seconds before they shut it down by choice, not by failure. In 4 minutes and 17 seconds, the compressed spatial field, small, contained, the size of a laboratory, had demonstrated a stable, repeatable effect that Vale Soren 7's instruments measured as consistent with the theoretical requirements for macro-scale FDL application. The platform's physics model, which had been running continuously for 11 months, updated its projection. 6 months to a working prototype drive. Vale Soren 7 stared at the number. 6 months. The galaxy had been building toward this moment for 60,000 years, and a species that had been a level 5 civilization 23 months ago was 6 months away from cracking it. The observer looked at Earth below. It was 3 a.m. in Geneva. The lights in the lab were still on. They were always still on. These people did not appear to sleep at the normal biological intervals their physiology required when they were close to something. They borrowed from themselves, took on debt with their own bodies, and paid it back later, or didn't, and kept going anyway. Vale Soren 7 sent the December data to Dovel with no message. Just the 6-month projection. The council emergency session was convened 11 days later. For the first time in Vale Soren 7's career, someone other than Dovel reviewed the observer's reports with urgency. For the first time in 60,000 years of galactic political history, the Council of Elder Species was not the most important thing happening in the galaxy. A small lab, 2 kilometers under Swiss Mountain was, and the people in it had absolutely no idea anyone was watching. The council emergency session lasted 9 days. Vale Soren 7 was not invited to attend. Observers of the 4th tier did not attend council sessions. They received summaries, filtered through the core administrative hierarchy, usually 3 weeks after the fact. But Dovel, who had apparently decided somewhere in the previous months that standard protocol was a framework for normal circumstances, and that these circumstances were categorically not normal, sent a live harmonic feed from the session chambers to the platform's comm array. It was not an authorized action. Vale Soren 7 did not report it. The session was, and this was itself extraordinary because elder species representatives had millennia of practice at institutional composure. Heated, not loudly. Elder species did not do things loudly, but heated in the particular way that very old, very settled minds get when they encounter something that threatens to reorganize their understanding of how the universe operates. The Vrithian representative, who had twice dismissed Vale Soren 7's escalations, was now sitting in the center of a debate it had helped delay by 2 years. The representative was not apologizing. Elder species representatives did not apologize. But the harmonic resonance patterns in the chamber had what Dovel's translation notes described as a quality of subdued recalculation. The debate had 3 factions. The first faction led by the Vrithian delegation and several of the older species cohorts, argued for what they called structure preparation. The humans would achieve FTL capability within months. This was now accepted. The appropriate response was to prepare a first contact framework, an established galactic protocol that had last been used 4,000 years ago when the Quelhari reached spacefaring status, and to position it for deployment when the humans made their first successful test. The framework was designed to welcome, orient, and integrate a new species into the galactic community with minimum disruption. It was thorough. It was well-tested. It had worked 4 times previously. The second faction, a coalition of mid-tier species who had themselves achieved FTL status within the last 50,000 years, and therefore had more recent memory of what that transition felt like, argued that the first contact framework was designed for civilizations that developed FTL on a normal timeline. A normal timeline meant there was a long development window, centuries, typically, during which the species moved from theoretical understanding to working technology, during which their culture and society and political structures evolved to incorporate the implications of what they were building, during which they arrived at FTL capability as a civilization ally mature entity that had already been living with the concept for generations. The humans had not had that window. They had gone from quantum field theory to spatial compression to practical FTL application in 23 months. Their civilization had not caught up. Their governments were still arguing about who owned the technology. Their public did not yet fully understand what was being built under those Swiss mountains. Their social, ethical, and political frameworks for being a spacefaring species did not exist yet. Deploying the standard first contact framework at a species in that condition, this faction argued, was like handing a loaded weapon to someone who didn't know they were holding a weapon. The third faction, the smallest, and in Vale Soren 7's assessment, the most honest, argued something simpler. They argued that it didn't matter what the council decided, because the council was not going to make any decision fast enough to matter. And the humans were not going to wait for a framework. They never waited. Vale Soren 7 listened to 9 days of this from orbit and watched the feeds from Geneva simultaneously. It was a particular kind of experience, watching very old beings debate the theoretical implications of a development while watching the development itself happen in real time, 37 light minutes below the debate's participants. By day 4 of the council session, Dr. Park's team had begun full component integration testing on what they were calling in the flat and functional language of people who were too busy to be dramatic about things, the drive assembly. By day 7, they had achieved stable field generation within the assembly framework for the first time. By day 9, when the council concluded its session with a resolution to begin drafting a modified first contact framework appropriate to the specific circumstances, a process that would take, by standard timeline, 18 months, the drive assembly had been tested successfully on 12 separate occasions. The council's resolution was 18 months. The human timeline was 3. In January of 2043, something happened that Vale Soren 7 had not anticipated, which was unusual because by this point the observer had been watching closely enough to usually see things coming a few weeks before they happened. Dr. Park called a press conference. Not a scientific publication. Not an institutional briefing. A press conference open to global media. Vale Soren 7 watched the setup from orbit, the camera crews, the broadcast infrastructure, the crowd of reporters gathering at the facility's external communications center in the cold Swiss January. Watched the preparation in the control room, where Dr. Park was reviewing notes with the focused calmness that Vale Soren 7 had come to recognize as her particular way of approaching something enormous. She was wearing the same jacket she always wore in the lab. Her team stood behind her. Cavalcanti was there, having flown in from Brazil the night before. The Lagos Materials team lead, Dr. Amaminsa, was on screen from her own facility. Dr. Park walked to the podium, looked at the cameras, and, in clear and direct language that required no translation from any language, because the meaning was carried in the plainness, in the refusal to obscure, told the world what they had built. Not all of it. The technical details were compressed, as they had to be, as they always are in a communication designed for a general audience. But the core of it, stripped to what mattered, they had demonstrated controlled spatial compression at macro scale. The mathematics indicated FTL transit was theoretically achievable with this mechanism. A prototype vehicle drive was in late-stage development. They expected a full-scale test within 90 days. 90 days. The world. Veil Soren 7 sensors tracked this in real time across the information network, when something that can only be described as electrically still for about 4 seconds. The kind of stillness that precedes the moment when a very large thing realizes what it is. Then it erupted. Not uniformly. Not cleanly. The eruption was everything simultaneously: celebration, fear, skepticism, accusation, wonder, anger, political argument, philosophical question, spiritual crisis, economic panic, and somewhere in all of it, in laboratories and universities and late-night conversations in apartments across the planet, the particular and unmistakable sound of people deciding that if this was happening, they wanted to be part of it. Veil Soren 7 watched this for 72 hours without sleep. A significant physiological choice for a species that required rest, because the data flowing through the human information network in those 72 hours was the most complete portrait of the species' emotional and psychological architecture that the observer had ever had access to. It was not a portrait of a civilization that had prepared itself for this moment. It was a portrait of a civilization that had been moving too fast to prepare, had arrived at the moment unprepared, and was now figuring it out in real time. This, Veil Soren 7 thought. This is what Dovell couldn't classify. Not the technology, not the velocity. This, the capacity to arrive at a world-changing moment completely unprepared for it, and to treat the unpreparedness not as a reason to stop, but as a problem to solve on the way to the next thing. The council, now fully engaged in a way it had not been before the press conference, made the situation a matter of public record, accelerated the framework drafting process. The previous 18-month estimate was revised to 6 months. Species representatives who had voted for structure preparation were now privately in the harmonic back channels that Veil Soren 7's comm array was still receiving without authorization from Dovell, expressing concern that 6 months was still too long, that the humans might make contact of a different kind before the framework was ready. There were, after all, other things in the galaxy besides the core and the council. Not all of them were patient observers. Not all of them were neutral. The galactic community was not, Veil Soren 7 had known for 300 years, a uniformly benevolent institution. It was a political body. It had competing interests, historical tensions, ideological factions. The elder species were not all in alignment on the question of how a rapidly developing civilization should be managed. Some species found rapid development inspiring. Some found it threatening. Some found it threatening in direct proportion to how capable the developing species appear to be. There was a word in the political vocabulary of the galactic community for a species that looked like it might, in the long run, become more capable than the species currently at the top of the development hierarchy. The word did not translate cleanly into any human language, but its closest functional equivalent was problem. In February of 2043, Veil 7 intercepted, not through any deliberate action, simply because the platform's passive sensors picked it up in the background radiation of the standard comm traffic, a series of directional transmissions that were not core authorized and not council documented. Type beam, encrypted in a format that the observer's system flagged as associated with a species known as the Hate Collective, who were not an elder species in the traditional sense, but who had held what could be described as regional influence in a sector that included Sol's neighborhood for approximately 12,000 years. The Hate Collective had no observer presence in the Sol system. They had no official standing to be transmitting anything in this direction. Veil Soren 7 filed the intercept with core intelligence and sent a copy directly to Dovell. Dovell's response was fast. Received. Under review. Do not act. Observe. Observe. In March, 83 days after the press conference, the drive assembly was moved from the testing chamber to the prototype vehicle. a craft that the humans were calling, in the flat, functional style that Veil Soren 7 had come to find almost affectionately characteristic of the species, Test Vehicle 1. TV-1. It was not an elegant name. It was a name that meant, this is the first one, this is the test, we will figure out the rest as we go. TV-1 was roughly 40 meters long, asymmetrical in a way that looked improvised, but wasn't. The asymmetry was functional, structural, a product of the engineering demands of the drive assembly. It was by any aesthetic standard of any species Veil Soren 7 had observed, not beautiful. It looked like something built by people who were in a hurry and knew it, which was exactly what it was. The test was scheduled for April 15th. Veil Soren 7 informed the Corps. The Corps informed the Council. The Council's modified first contact framework was 30% drafted. On April 12th, 3 days before the test, the Hate collective transmissions spiked in volume and frequency. Veil Soren 7's sensors, now running at maximum sensitivity on direct instruction from Corps intelligence, who had apparently decided the intercepts were significant enough to warrant aggressive monitoring, detected what appeared to be a positioning signal. Something moving in the outer solar system. Something that had not been there in the previous quarterly survey. A ship, not a Corps vessel, not a Council-registered craft. A Hate collective vessel, running dark, positioned in the Kuiper Belt approximately 42 astronomical units from Earth. Veil Soren 7 filed the detection immediately with full sensor data, marked Priority 1. Dovel's response, confirmed. Intervention team en route. ETA 4 weeks. Do not make contact with the Hate vessel. Do not alert the humans. Observe. For weeks. The test was in 3 days. Veil Soren 7 sat in the chair in front of the viewing screen and looked at Earth and thought about what observe meant. About 300 years of training that distilled to that one word. About the protocol and the reason for the protocol, that observer interference in developmental events corrupted the data, introduced variables that couldn't be controlled, changed outcomes in ways that couldn't be undone. About the principle behind the rule, a civilization's development had to be its own. If it was shaped by outside hands, it wasn't its own story. And it needed to be its own story. The integrity of the outcome depended on it. All of that was true. It was also true that a Hate collective vessel positioned and transmitting in ways that Dovel's expression in a subsequent message had described, in a harmonic register Veil, Soren 7's translation algorithms flagged as rare, as concerning, was 42 AU from species that did not know existed. Observe. Veil Soren 7 looked at the feed from a facility in Switzerland, where Dr. Park was reviewing pre-test checklists with her team. At the feed from Lagos, where Mensa was running final material stress simulations. At the 12,000 contributors on the open-source platform, many of whom had been awake for 36 hours working through last-minute modeling problems. At TV1, assembled and waiting. At the Kuiper Belt, the observer made a decision. Not to intervene. Not yet. To be ready to. That distinction, Veil Soren 7 would spend a long time justifying to the Corps afterward. It was a meaningful distinction. The observer did not act. Moved no resources. Changed nothing. Simply recalibrated, in the privacy of the platform's closed operational framework, the weight assigned to the word observe. It no longer meant only watch. It meant watch and understand what watching is for. April 15th arrived like all days arrive for a species that has been alive for 400,000 years. Unremarkably, in the flow of time, indistinguishable from the day before and the day after except by what happened in it. The launch window opened at 0600 UTC. TV-1 lifted from the facility's exterior launch pad on conventional propulsion, chemical thrusters, because the spatial compression drive was not designed to operate in a gravity well and required open space to initialize safely. The lift was clean. No anomalies. The craft rose through the atmosphere in 18 minutes and achieved stable orbit 40 minutes after launch. Veil Soren 7 watched it rise. It was small against the black. 40 meters of asymmetrical metal and hope and calculated audacity built by a species that had been discussing whether FTL was theoretically possible as recently as 14 months ago. The drive initialization sequence began at 0847 UTC. At 0851, the spatial compression field came online. Veil Soren 7's instruments registered at first as a ripple, a perturbation in the local space-time geometry that the platform's sensors were calibrated to detect at extreme sensitivity. Small, then less small, the field building toward the threshold parameters. At 0853, the threshold was reached. At 0853 and 14 seconds, TV1 was not where it had been. It was 0.3 astronomical units away. In the span of 14 seconds of compressed transit, which from TV1's internal frame had lasted approximately 4 seconds, the craft had crossed a distance that light took 2.5 minutes to cover. It wasn't fast, not by galactic standards, not by the standards of the FTL drives that the elder species had been refining for 60,000 years. It was slow, inefficient, power-hungry, and the craft's internal stress readouts were going to need serious analysis before anyone flew it with a crew. It worked. Veil Soren 7 sat very still for 31 seconds. Then, across the open sensor field, in the direction of the Kuiper Belt, the Hate Collective vessel moved. The Hate Collective vessel moved at speed. Not toward Earth. Not directly. It moved on an intercept vector for TV1, which was sitting in low solar orbit 2.5 million kilometers from where it had started, running post-transit diagnostics, and sending telemetry back to Geneva in the flat, data-dense format of a team trying to understand what had just happened to their instruments. They had no idea what was coming toward them. Veil Soren 7 ran the intercept calculation in under 2 seconds. The Hate vessel was faster, significantly faster, than TV1 in its current state. TV1 could not reinitialize the drive for a minimum of 20 minutes. The power system needed a full recharge cycle. The craft had no defensive systems. The crew. There was no crew yet. TV1 was remotely operated on its first flight, but the data, the telemetry, the proof of concept streaming back to Earth at the speed of light was everything the species needed. If the Hate vessel disabled TV1 before it completed that transmission, the data stream would cut off. It would be a setback, not an ending. The humans would build another one. But the Hate Collective apparently judged that it was worth attempting. Veil Soren 7 had standing orders. Observe. The observer considered those orders for approximately 4 seconds. Then activated the platform's active systems, the ones reserved for emergency core operations, the ones that Veil Soren 7 had not touched in 312 years of service, and moved the platform between the Hate vessel and TV1. 40 meters of cloaked observation disk, interposing itself against a Hate warship approximately 200 meters long. It was not, objectively, a compelling show of force. But the platform carried a core identification beacon, which when activated broadcast on every frequency in the galactic communication spectrum simultaneously, and which communicated in the most unambiguous language that 37 elder species had spent 60,000 years developing, something that translated to, "This is a protected observation zone. Any hostile action here constitutes a direct violation of Council jurisdiction, and the entity responsible for this zone has just notified the full core and Council of your presence and vector." The Hate vessel stopped. It did not leave. It held position at 12,000 kilometers, far enough to be non-threatening on paper, close enough to make a point. Veil Soren 7 had 3 simultaneous open channels: the core uplink to Dovel, the Hate vessel's open frequency response to the beacon, and the Earth broadcast spectrum carrying TV1's telemetry back to Geneva. On the Geneva channel, Dr. Park's voice, audio only, reading system diagnostics aloud in the quick flat cadence she used when processing information faster than she could fully verbalize. The transit telemetry was good. The drive had functioned within projected parameters. The post-transit structural assessment was showing acceptable stress levels. She was already talking about the next test. On the core channel, Dovel, whose harmonic resonance had a quality that Veil Soren 7's translation algorithms had never categorized before, and which the observer mentally filed as something between alarm and this was the strange part, something warmer. "You have broken protocol," Dovell said. "The intervention team is now 6 hours out rather than 4 weeks. The council has been notified. The Hate Collective is filing a formal objection." A pause. "The human craft completed its telemetry transmission 9 minutes ago. The data is fully received. Whatever the Hate Collective intended is too late for that intention to matter." On the Hate channel, silence. Then, a single transmission in formal galactic standard. Legal language. The objection being filed in real time. The Hate representative citing observer interference in developmental zone operations, claiming Veil Soren 7 had exceeded jurisdictional authority, all of which was technically correct. The observer had exceeded jurisdictional authority. The observer filed a full incident report, attached all sensor data, including the intercept trajectory and the pretest positioning evidence, and sent it simultaneously to Dovell, the full council, and core intelligence. Then waited. The waiting did not last long. The core intervention team, a pair of enforcement-rated vessels that operated with considerably more authority and considerably more physical capability than a fourth-tier observation platform, arrived at Sol 6 hours later, as Dovell had indicated. They positioned themselves in the outer system in direct visual range of the Hate vessel and broadcast their own identification on all frequencies. The message was clearer than Veil Soren 7's had been, because enforcement vessels communicated less diplomatically than observation platforms. The Hate vessel left. It was not an ending. Political situations involving elder species and their regional interests did not end with a warship departing. There would be hearings. There would be the formal objection proceeding. There would be a very long period of institutional argument about what Veil Soren 7 had done and whether it had been correct. The observer knew all of this and accepted it fully. The choice had been made with full understanding of its consequences. The consequences were not what the observer was thinking about. What Veil Soren 7 was thinking about was Earth. Because while all of this had been happening, the Hate vessel's approach, the beacon activation, the platform's interposition, the 6-hour wait for the intervention team, Earth had been doing what Earth always did. Moving, building, processing. The news of TV1's successful test had broken into the global information network within minutes of the telemetry confirmation. The eruption this time was different from the one after the press conference. The press conference had been announcement, theoretical, future-pointed, something that was going to happen. This was different. This was confirmation. This had happened. The FTL drive worked. TV1 had moved. Veil Soren 7 watched the species receive this information. It was, and the observer would spend considerable time in subsequent years trying to describe it accurately in official reports, ultimately concluding that the standard core emotional classification vocabulary was inadequate and requesting a vocabulary expansion. It was not the reaction of a species that had been expecting to feel this way. It was the reaction of a species that had been moving so fast toward a thing that when the thing arrived, they were genuinely surprised by how it felt. The celebrations were real. The tears were real. The arguments were real, because this was still a species divided along dozens of political and economic and ideological lines, and the advent of FTL travel did not dissolve those lines. It just redirected them toward the new question of who got to use the technology, and how and for what. But underneath all of it, in the research teams staying awake, in the open-source platform that by noon of April 15th had 17,000 contributors uploading drive improvement proposals in the DR. Parker was already in the conference room with her team breaking down what the transit data told them needed to be fixed for Test 2. Underneath all of it was something that Veil Soren 7 had been watching for 2 years and 2 months and had still not fully translated. The observer tried again in the incident report that the council would eventually read. What I have observed over the course of this posting, Veil Soren 7 wrote, is not simply a development velocity anomaly. Velocity can be measured and categorized. What I cannot categorize is the mechanism generating the velocity. After 2 years and 2 months of continuous observation, I believe the mechanism is this. This species has an unusual relationship to the gap between what they are and what they're trying to become. Most species I have data on experience that gap as a kind of weight, a resistance to be overcome, a reminder of limitation. This species appears to experience it as a direction. Not something to push against, but something to move toward. The limitation is not the wall. It is the door. They do not see the gap as evidence of what they cannot do. They see it as information about what they have not done yet. Vale, Soren, 7 paused in the writing. Outside the platform, the Sol system was doing what it had been doing for 4.5 billion years, revolving, burning, silent except for the light. Except for the new thing that had been there for approximately 300,000 years, give or take, which was a thin layer of carbon-based bipeds doing things to the third rock that would have been unrecognizable to the same species 6,000 years ago. I cannot tell you where this leads, the observer continued. I cannot model the development trajectory with any confidence beyond approximately 5 years, because the standard models do not account for the mechanism I am describing. What I can tell you is what I have watched happen in 26 months. A species rated level 5 at the time of my assignment has achieved working FTL technology. The translation problem, which the Council's representative estimated would consume a generation, was resolved in 18 months. The mechanism the Council's representative cited as an effective ceiling, the gap between theoretical and applied, was not a ceiling for this species. It was a starting point. The report went on. It would eventually fill 340 pages. The Council would read all of it. Several elder species representatives would later acknowledge, in the indirect and institutional way of very old diplomatic bodies, that earlier assessment had been premature. The Vrithian representative's acknowledgement was the most indirect, but it was there. In May of 2043, the first contact framework was deployed, not in a modified form the Council had been drafting, but in an emergency revised version developed in 72 hours by a joint committee that had apparently read Vale Soren 7's reports and concluded that a framework designed for civilizations on normal developmental timelines was not appropriate here. The revision was imperfect. These things always were. But it was faster and more honest than what it had replaced. And when the contact vessel, a formal core diplomatic ship, crewed by representatives of 6 species, arrived in Sol orbit on the 23rd of May, it arrived with documents that at least attempted to address the reality of what Earth was rather than the category Earth had been assumed to fit. The first formal contact broadcast was transmitted to Earth at 11:42 UTC on May 23, 2043. It was received, confirmed, authenticated against multiple independent receiving stations. Dr. Park was in a meeting when her assistant brought her the notification. She read it, then looked up at the team around her and said in the flat and functional language of a person who was processing something enormous and had decided to process it by moving forward. Okay, so that's a new variable. She looked at her coffee, looked at the notification again. We're going to need a bigger table. Vale, Soren, 7 heard this through the audio feed and filed it verbatim in the incident report under the heading Characteristic Species Response to Paradigm-Altering Information. The formal proceedings that followed the first contact were long and complicated and often contentious and would take decades to fully establish. The humans brought to the table everything they brought to every table. Their divisions, their politics, their competing interests, their simultaneous capacity for breathtaking generosity and grinding institutional stubbornness. They negotiated hard. They asked questions that elder species representatives had not been asked before, partly because younger species usually approach the galactic community with more deference, and partly because the humans had a way of identifying the thing everyone else had agreed not to ask, and asking it clearly and without particular apology. The hate collective situation was resolved in the galactic courts over 3 years, in a proceeding that became a significant precedent case for the rights of non-affiliated species observing in developmental zones. Vale, Soren, 7 was required to testify. The observer's breach of protocol was formally documented and a notation added to the service record. The breach was also formally designated as having been conducted in the interest of preserving developmental zone integrity. The precise wording of the designation had been worked on by core legal for weeks, because it needed to simultaneously acknowledge the breach and justify the outcome. The humans, who had been given access to summaries of the proceedings once they joined the galactic community's legal framework, found the whole thing interesting in the way they found most things interesting, as a problem to understand and a conversation to have. Dr. Park, who had by 2046 become the de facto human representative on the Galactic Physics Standards Body, asked Soren 7 about the platform interposition at a joint working session where Soren 7 had been invited to present the 2-year observational data. "You didn't have to do that," she said. Not accusatory, genuinely curious, in a way she was genuinely curious about everything. "No," Soren 7 said. "But you did." "Yes." She looked at the observer the way she looked at a physics model that had produced an unexpected result, with the specific attention of someone who wanted to understand the mechanism, not just the outcome. "What?" Soren 7 thought about this. About 300 years of training. About observe. About the 4 seconds between the hate vessel's movement and the beacon activation. About the thing that had happened in those 4 seconds that no protocol could fully account for. "I had been watching you for 2 years, the observer said. "I had a strong intuition about where things were going." Dr. Park looked at the observer for a moment. Then, a small, compressed smile that Soren 7 had learned, over 2 years of watching the species, to recognize as the expression for something understood at a level below the need to say it. "Fair enough," she said. Turned back to the physics. Kept going. That was the thing. After everything, after the first test, and the contact, and the hearings, and the years of negotiation, and all the noise and weight of a species entering a galactic community that had existed without them for 60,000 years, that was still the defining quality. The keeping going, not the achievement, not the capability, the motion itself. The refusal to treat any destination as a destination rather than a direction. Soren 7 wrote about this at length in the final section of the official 2-year observational report, about what it meant for the galactic community to have a species in it that operated this way, about the questions it raised and the fears it generated and the possibilities it opened that had not existed before, about the fact that the galaxy was genuinely, measurably different now, not because of the FDL drive, not because of the first contact, but because of something harder to quantify, the introduction into the galactic conversation of voice that did not seem to understand at a bone-deep constitutional level that there were things that could not be done. Other species had voices. Other species argued, contributed, challenged. But they argued within frameworks. They challenged within the established architecture of what had already been proven possible. They were, in the end, shaped by 60,000 years of collective knowledge about what the ceiling was. Humans had arrived 2 years ago not knowing the ceiling existed. They were still not convinced it did. The report concluded, "I was assigned to this post expecting to document a mid-range civilization's steady progress toward a predictable plateau. What I have documented instead is something I do not have a category for. I will suggest one. I will suggest that what I have observed for 26 months is what it looks like when a species decides, without being told it is allowed to, that the galaxy is theirs to understand. Not to conquer, not to control, to understand. In all the ways that word means, scientifically, politically, philosophically, relationally. They want to know how it works. They want to know all of it. They will not stop wanting to know. And I think the galaxy, which has been operating with a particular understanding of its own architecture for a very long time, is going to have to decide what it does with a species for whom that architecture is not a given, but a question." Dovel's response to the report, received 48 hours after submission, was the longest message the supervisor had ever sent. The last line of it read, "I have been in service for 900,000 years. I believe this is the most interesting thing I have ever seen. I also believe you were right to file the Cascade risk assessment. I also believe no existing Cascade risk protocol adequately covers what this actually is. I recommend, and I will be submitting this formally to core leadership, that we develop new categories, beginning with one that does not describe this species as a risk. Dovell did not specify what the new category should be called, but 900,000 years was a long time to learn harmonic resonance, and Veilsorn 7 had been listening to the supervisor's pattern for 300 years, and the tone in which the word risk had been delivered, it sounded like wonder. The galaxy had shaken, quietly, not from an explosion or a weapon or a war, from the sound of something waking up that had been asleep for 60,000 years, the possibility that the ceiling was not a ceiling, that the edges were not edges, that the thing everyone had agreed was the limit of what could be known was simply the last question anyone had bothered to ask. A species of bipedal carbon-based organisms on the third planet of an unremarkable star system in a moderately dense region of the galaxy's arm had done this. They had done it in 26 months. They had done it while afraid. Veilsorn 7 looked at the Earth below the platform and thought, I have been an observer for 300 years. I have been trained to watch and document and not feel the weight of what I'm watching. I have done that mostly. I have done it well, mostly. I'm not doing it right now. Right now, I am watching a small blue planet full of improbable, stubborn, noise-making beings who have just decided, not asked permission to decide, not negotiated the terms of the decision, just decided that the galaxy is a thing they're going to understand. And I'm thinking that the galaxy has no idea what it just agreed to. And I am, against all protocol, against all training, against all 300 years of carefully maintained professional distance, I am glad.